Living on the road, waterways or off-grid in the UK, Dickie Dread. And we're now on to Chapter 3, Living on the Land or Water, Parking Up and Planning Reality. I'll give you a quick summary of Chapter 3 and then we'll move on to the actual sections. So Chapter 3 looks at one of the biggest questions facing anyone who lives on the road or on the waterways or off-grid on land. Where can you actually stay? Many people begin with the assumption that the answer is found in the law. Now imagine there must be a list of places where you can live and places where you cannot. In reality, things are rarely that simple. Throughout this chapter, we will see that the written law is only one part of the picture. What often matters just as much is visibility, local attitudes, enforcement priorities, and how much attention your presence attracts. For vehicle dwellers, the challenge is finding places to stop without causing problems for local residents, businesses or landowners. Different locations carry different levels of risk. A quiet industrial estate may be tolerated for a night, while a residential street may attract complaints within hours. Success often comes down to staying discreet, moving regularly and understanding how an area functions. For boat dwellers, many of the same principles apply. Continuous cruisers must genuinely navigate rather than remaining permanently in one location. The waterways offer freedom, but they also come with their own rules, responsibilities, enforcement systems. Movement remains a key part of that, maintaining that freedom. For people living off-grid on land, planning law becomes increasingly important. Ownership of land does not automatically give you the right to live on it. Agricultural land, woodland and other rural sites all come with restrictions that can catch newcomers by surprise. Understanding planning law, permitted development rights and enforcement procedures is essential before making long-term decisions. The common thread running through the entire chapter is that successful mobile and off-grid living is rarely about finding loopholes. It's about understanding the systems that govern space, visibility and enforcement. Those who attract little attention, maintain good relationships and understand the rules are often left alone. Those who become highly visible, create complaints or misunderstand the legal framework can quickly find themselves facing difficulties. In the next chapter, so chapter 4, we'll move on to the practical realities of establishing and maintaining a place to live, looking at the challenges, opportunities, day-to-day considerations, creating a sustainable home beyond the conventional housing system. So we're now on to part 19 of the video series and we're on chapter 3, Living on the Land or Water, Parking Up and Planning Reality. So we're led to believe that if you own a vehicle, buy a boat or even purchase a piece of land, then what you do with it is largely your own business. But that does not appear to be the case in reality. Because once you actually try to live in that vehicle, stay on that land or make that boat your home, a whole different system starts to appear. One built as much on visibility, complaints and perception as on written law. Because once you actually try to live differently, the system starts behaving very differently. So, who really decides where you're allowed to exist? So we'll start chapter 3 now. For most people, this way of living does not begin with land. It begins with movement. A van, a bus, a caravan, boat or whatever can be adapted to shelter becomes the first step away from fixed housing. At that stage, the transition often feels straightforward. You leave behind rent, contracts and permanence and replace them with movement, improvisation and choice. For some, the movement happens on roads. For others, it happens along waterways. But that sense of simplicity does not last long. The legal framework behind that shift is not uniform across the UK. While much of what follows reflects England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland operate under separate planning systems, governed primarily by the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997 and the Planning Act Northern Ireland 2011, with different legislation, enforcement approaches and interpretations. Key differences are noted where they materially affect the outcome. Very quickly, another structure begins to emerge. It's not written down and it is not formally taught, but it governs what is possible just as much as any legal system. In Scotland, the legal position sits within a different planning structure, and while the same pressures of visibility and complaint apply, trespass and land access are treated differently in law. Northern Ireland again follows its own planning framework, often with more restrictive approaches to isolated or rural residential use. It is a system built from visibility, perception, complaint and response. It operates through thresholds rather than clear rules, and it varies from place to place, sometimes street to street. Learning to live within the system is not about memorising laws. It's about understanding how attention works, how patterns form, and how quickly tolerance can shift once those patterns become visible. It's often assumed that Scotland offers greater freedom for parking up, largely due to its access laws. While the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003 does provide broader rights for access and wild camping, these do not extend to living in vehicles. There is no national permit system for vehicle dwelling, but local schemes and bylaws do exist in high-pressure areas such as Loch Lomond or the Trossachs National Park, where permits may be required and overnight stays restricted. So stopping, parking, mooring and the lived system rather than the legal one. At the beginning, most people approach parking with a legal mindset. They look for signs, check restrictions and try to determine what is allowed. That instinct makes sense, particularly for those coming from settled housing, where legality and permission tend to define what is possible. For boat dwellers, the equivalent of parking is mooring. The same principles apply. Legality matters, but tolerance often matters more. However, roadside living does not operate primarily on formal permission. It operates on tolerance. A vehicle may be legally parked and still be moved on because someone objects to its presence. Equally, a vehicle may remain in a technically questionable place for extended periods without any intervention at all. It creates a subtle but important shift. The question becomes not, is this allowed, but will this attract attention, and if it does, how will that attention be handled? Most people eventually realise they are working within an informal threshold. Below that threshold, they are largely invisible and left alone. Above it, they become a problem, and someone feels the need to resolve. That threshold is not fixed. It's shaped by the environment, by local attitudes, by recent events, sometimes by nothing more than the mood of the person who notices you. On the water, the same system applies, but through mooring, navigation and visibility rather than parking. On the water, the equivalent of parking is mooring, and this is where most regulation actually bites. There are two main categories: boats with a home mooring and continuous cruisers, no fixed mooring. Continuous cruisers are required to move regularly and make genuine progress around the network. This is often misunderstood. It does not mean shifting a few metres every 2 weeks. It means moving through different areas over time. We've covered this a couple of times now. Enforcement here follows the same pattern seen on land: visibility, pattern, response. A boat that remains in one place too long will be noticed, recorded and eventually acted upon. As with road living, the issue is not just legality, but pattern. So how different spaces actually behave. Different environments create different forms of tolerance, and understanding those differences is central to staying below the threshold. Industrial estates are often one of the most workable options. During the day, they are busy and functional, filled with vehicles that belong to businesses. At night, they empty out, creating a kind of temporary neutrality. A vehicle parked there overnight can blend into the broader pattern of use, particularly if it arrives late and leaves early. However, this only works if the vehicle behaves like part of that pattern. If it remains during working hours or begins to show signs of occupation, it quickly becomes visible. Laybys offer a different kind of cover. They are designed for stopping, which gives them a degree of legitimacy, but they are also exposed. A vehicle that remains for too long or that clearly appears inhabited can attract attention from passing drivers or local residents. Residential streets are highly variable. In some areas, particularly where parking is dense and varied, a vehicle can blend in effectively. In others, especially quieter or more affluent areas, even a single unfamiliar vehicle can be noticed quickly. Large car parks can provide short-term options. Supermarkets, retail parks and hospitals all operate on constant turnover, which can mask presence not for a night or two, but they are increasingly controlled through cameras, time limits and private enforcement companies, and relying on them repeatedly tends to lead to problems. Rural locations often appear attractive because of their isolation, but they can be deceptive. A vehicle in a quiet rural area may be far more noticeable precisely because there is so little else around it. In these environments, a single complaint can trigger rapid action. The small decisions that make the difference. So what becomes clear over time is that survival is not determined by big decisions but by small ones, repeated consistently. Timing is one of the most effective tools available. Arriving after dark reduces visibility significantly. Leaving early avoids being present during the hours when people are most active and observant. The vehicle that exists only during sleeping hours is far less likely to be perceived as a dwelling. Containment is equally important. The boundary of the vehicle is also the boundary of tolerance. Once activity spills outside that boundary, the space begins to look occupied rather than used. Chairs, tables, cooking equipment, or even extended periods with doors open can all shift perception. Movement is essential. Staying in one place for too long creates familiarity. Familiarity leads to recognition. Recognition leads to complaint. Rotating between multiple locations prevents one place from becoming associated with a particular vehicle. Even the appearance of the vehicle matters. A vehicle that looks roadworthy and functional tends to attract less attention than one that appears abandoned or heavily altered. This is not about hiding, but about not signalling permanence. These practices do not remove risk, they reduce it, often significantly. Waterways create their own version of these environments. Urban towpaths can function like residential streets, high visibility, high sensitivity to unfamiliar presence. Visitor moorings resemble short-stay car parks, useful for limited periods but increasingly monitored and time-restricted. Continuous cruising routes, particularly in less populated stretches, operate more like rotation networks, where movement itself maintains tolerance. Marinas and paid moorings offer stability, similar to formal sites on land, but at the cost of fees, contracts and reduced flexibility. Remote moorings may appear secluded, but like rural laybys, they can draw attention precisely because they stand out. On the water, movement is often a formal requirement as well as an informal one. Remaining in one place for too long can trigger both complaint and enforcement, particularly where continuous cruising rules apply. On inland waterways, the legal framework differs. Navigation is governed primarily through licensing rather than parking law. In England and Wales, the Canal and River Trust regulates most canals and some rivers. Boats must be licensed, insured, and in most cases either have a home mooring or be used for continuous cruising. Continuous cruising does not simply mean movement. It requires genuine navigation rather than remaining within a small area. So I keep repeating this, but it's important. Guidance suggests progressive travel rather than short shuttling between nearby points, although interpretation can vary. Mooring is subject to additional controls, including time limits on visitor moorings and local restrictions in high demand areas. As with roadside living, much depends on visibility, pattern and complaint rather than strict legal thresholds alone. So living on the road, waterways or land is often governed less by clear permission and more by visibility, tolerance and attention. So understanding the system means understanding people as much as laws. The issue may not just be parking, mooring, planning permission or stopping places. It might actually be who gets to exist outside the standard housing model. So how much freedom do we really have if simply being visible can become a problem? Right, next up, still in chapter 3, living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality, and we will cover when things go wrong, what the law covers and what it does not, the knock and what it really means, and the gradual pull towards land.